Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into something quietly strange. Rules from the Middle Ages that somehow still shape your life today, even though no one remembers why they existed in the first place. From old market laws to bizarre household habits, you'll realize just how many medieval routines you're still following without ever thinking about them. Before we start unraveling these forgotten rules, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy the calm, sleepy history we explore here. And as always, drop a comment telling me where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you right now. It's always comforting to see this sleepy little community gathering from all across the world. Now, dim the lights, settle in, maybe let a fan hum softly in the background, and let's ease into tonight's slow journey through the medieval habits that quietly live on in your everyday life. Why medieval rules still shape your daily routine. You might not realize it, but the rhythm of your day, the hours you keep, the habits you follow, even the quiet little rules that shape your routines, is built on the bones of medieval Europe. Many of these rules are so deeply woven into your life that you never question them. They simply exist, like the soft hum of a clock you stopped hearing long ago. Yet if you peel back the layers of your day, you begin to see the faint outlines of habits that were already old before your ancestors were born. In this first section, you will wander through a landscape where nothing is dramatic and everything is quietly significant, tracing the ancient patterns that still guide your movements. You begin with time itself. You wake up, perhaps not at dawn, but according to a schedule marked by the hours of a clock. That idea, that the day should be carved into numbered hours, was not always the natural order of things. In medieval Europe, timekeeping was the responsibility of monks, whose strict prayer schedule divided the day into segments called canonical hours. You can imagine a small stone abbey, its walls cold even in summer, where a monk pulled the rope of a heavy bell each time a prayer was due. That bell wasn't just a signal for worship, it was the heartbeat of the entire community. Farmers stopped their work, merchants paused their counting, and even travelers on the road listened for the sound as a reminder of how much of the day had passed. Centuries later, when you glance at a clock to see if you're running late, you're following a system designed not for efficiency, but for devotion. The monk's bell eventually became the town bell, and the town bell became the clock tower, and the clock tower became the digital numbers glowing beside your bed. But the concept, time divided by ringing bells, remains unchanged. The medieval world, you notice, left a quiet but persistent mark on every hour you live. Another rule you unconsciously follow is the idea of the workday. The notion that work should take place during certain hours, generally in the daytime, is medieval at its core. In an age before electricity, daylight was the only resource that mattered. People labored when the sun allowed them to see. There was no romantic burning of midnight oil for productivity. Candles were expensive and dangerous, and few households wasted them. A single candle could represent hours of wages for a laborer. Because of that, society shaped itself around the sun, not the other way around. Today, even with bright screens that imitate daylight, much of the world still clings to these patterns, waking early and resting at night, as if the medieval sun still dictated the human schedule. You might also notice that your sense of order, standing in lines, taking turns, following unwritten rules of courtesy, comes from medieval laws intended to keep towns from descending into chaos. Medieval markets, for instance, were tightly regulated spaces. You would have seen long rows of wooden stalls, each assigned to specific merchants, where the placement of a butcher or a baker mattered as much as the cleanliness of their goods. Inspectors roamed the aisles to ensure everyone followed the rules, not because people were naturally immoral, but because a crowded space with no structure quickly turned into confusion. Today, when you queue at a supermarket or wait politely at a traffic light, you are participating in an order that began in those earliest markets, where rules were created simply to prevent the crush of bodies and the frustration of buyers. The way you eat also carries echoes of the medieval world. Consider this simple act of using a table. Tables did exist in antiquity, but in medieval Europe they became more standardized. A table meant order. Meals were communal and hierarchical, with seating arrangements that reinforced social structure. Lords sat at the high table, while peasants or servants sat at the lower ones. Over time, these customs evolved into the modern dining table, a place where families gather at fixed times, often inherited from medieval meal schedules determined not by hunger, but by the availability of firewood and daylight. Even your utensils, especially the fork, tell a story of slow cultural acceptance. The fork appeared in medieval courts as a scandalous novelty, criticized for being too refined or unnecessary. Yet today you would feel strange eating without one, a reminder of how deeply medieval etiquette has seeped into your habits. One of the most unnoticed rules you still follow is the concept of property boundaries. Medieval communities developed strict systems of land measurement, using long, tedious units like rods, chains, and furlongs. These measurements determined everything from farmland to footpaths, and the consistency mattered because disputes were common. Land meant survival. If someone planted a hedge 2 feet over the boundary, conflict followed. Although the units have changed, the idea that land must be clearly divided persists today. Fences, walls, property lines, and even invisible borders inside homes. Your bedroom versus the living room reflect the medieval belief that space must be controlled and defined. Then there is your surname. If you carry a last name like Baker, Miller, Wright, or Hill, you are literally walking around with a medieval rule attached to your identity. Surnames became necessary in medieval Europe because governments needed better ways to track taxes and property. People with common first names, John, Thomas, or Mary, had to be distinguished from one another. So naming conventions arose. A person was identified by occupation, place of origin, or even physical traits. The quiet logic behind this rule never went away. Today, governments still require last names, though the reasons have transformed from tax collection to identity verification. Yet the rule itself remains rooted in medieval paperwork. Your sense of cleanliness also carries medieval remnants. While the stereotype suggests medieval people never bathed, the truth is more nuanced. Public bathhouses were common in many towns, and certain communities placed great importance on washing. Other places, especially after the Black Death, imposed strict rules about hygiene to control disease. Over centuries, these rules shifted, merged, and eventually formed modern practices. The concept of regular washing, not out of comfort but out of communal responsibility, has its origins in these medieval anxieties. Even the simple rule of washing hands before meals has medieval precedents, rooted in concerns about both manners and health. The food you eat and the way it is sold also reflect medieval regulations. Weights and measures were standardized to prevent merchants from cheating customers. A baker who sold loaves underweight could be fined or punished. This is why the baker's dozen, 13 instead of 12, came into existence. Bakers added an extra loaf to avoid accusations of selling short weight. Today, while no modern baker fears being tied to a post and publicly shamed, many still follow the tradition of throwing in a little extra, a silent echo of medieval caution. Another rule you never question is the concept of the household. Medieval households were not just families, but economic units. They included servants, apprentices, and sometimes unrelated workers, all living under one roof. The head of the household held legal responsibility for everyone inside. This ancient structure influenced modern ideas of family, responsibility, and domestic order. Even the division of rooms, kitchens separate from bedrooms, communal areas separate from private ones, reflects medieval architectural thinking, where fire safety and hierarchy shaped the layout of homes. Your idea of law and punishment also traces back to medieval codes. Courts, juries, and local assemblies developed slowly, often painfully. Early courts were held outdoors, under trees, or near church walls. Cases were decided through a mix of testimonies and oaths, and while the systems evolved significantly, their foundations persist. The notion that disputes should be settled by a neutral body, rather than revenge, was one of the most significant medieval contributions to society. Whenever you sign a contract, follow a regulation, or expect fairness from an institution, you are engaging with rules born from those early gatherings where villagers tried to make sense of justice. Even the idea of rest days comes from medieval religious rules. Sunday as a day of rest was enforced by the church and later by local authorities. Markets closed, work stopped, and even games were restricted. The pace of life slowed not because people wanted leisure, but because it was mandated. Today, although many societies have secularized, the structure of a weekly cycle remains in place. You likely feel the quiet weight of Sunday, even if you are not religious. The world simply moves differently on that day. As you drift through these observations, you begin to see that your life is built on countless decisions made centuries ago by people who never imagined a world of electricity, smartphones, or global travel. Their rules, practical, mundane, often tedious, survive because they worked well enough to become invisible. And the invisible, as you notice, is often the most persistent. But perhaps the most curious part is not the rules themselves, but why you still follow them so effortlessly. Is it simply because society has always done so? Or is there something deeper in human nature that clings to old structures, even when they no longer serve their original purpose? And as you consider the quiet persistence of medieval rules in your daily life, you may find yourself wondering, which of these rules still shape your routine for no reason at all? And how many more remain hidden beneath the surface of your day? If you look closely at the quiet routines that make up your day, you begin to notice that many of them did not emerge from modern logic or efficiency. Instead, they descended from layers of medieval habits, accumulated like dust on a wooden shelf. kept simply because no one bothered to remove them. In this second section, you will sink a little deeper into those layers, exploring how bureaucratic habits, everyday objects, transportation systems, and social expectations from the Middle Ages still shape the way you move through life, often without you noticing. You can begin with something as simple as paperwork, forms, signatures, identification numbers, and the expectation that your identity must be verifiable. This impulse did not begin with nation-states or digital systems, but rather with medieval lords and church authorities who needed a reliable method to track people. Early medieval villagers often lived their entire lives without ever leaving records, and this lack of documentation created countless problems. Taxes were difficult to collect. Disputes about land dragged on for years. Inheritance disagreements turned neighbors against each other. To solve these issues, local authorities gradually developed systems of record keeping. You might imagine a small wooden chest in a medieval town hall, filled with parchment rolls tied with string. Each roll contained long lists of names, occupations, duties, and disputes. A scribe, usually the only literate person in the community, kept these records with meticulous care. His work was tedious, slow, and often dull, but essential. Over time, towns adopted rules that required births, marriages, and deaths to be recorded in official registers. When you fill out a form today, when you scribble your name, address, or date of birth, you are performing a ritual that originated in the medieval effort to bring order to a world that often felt chaotic. Even the idea of signatures can be traced back to medieval habits. In an age before mass literacy, signatures were unusual. People used symbols, seals, or marks instead. A seal, a stamped impression in wax, served as proof of authenticity. The idea that your personal mark carried legal weight eventually evolved into modern signatures, and later into digital verification methods. Yet the underlying rule persists. Society still needs a symbolic gesture that confirms your identity and your intent. It is a medieval idea wrapped in a modern interface. You can turn next to the concept of travel. The roads you use today, straight highways, carefully drawn borders, towns spaced at predictable distances, are quieter echoes of medieval patterns. In medieval Europe, road building was slow and uneven, but certain rules shaped the landscape. Roads followed property boundaries, ridgelines, and old Roman paths. They curved not because engineers designed them to do so, but because farmers resisted giving up land. You can still see these odd bends in many modern roads, reminders of ancient negotiations between villagers who fought to keep every scrap of soil they could. In many regions, distance was measured not in miles, but in the time it took to walk. Towns tended to emerge at intervals that made sense for travelers on foot or horseback. A day's walk, half a day's journey, or the distance needed before animals required water or rest. When you drive today through long stretches of road dotted with towns at almost predictable intervals, you are witnessing the remnants of medieval geographic logic. Even highways built in the 20th century had to curve around or through ancient settlements whose positions had been fixed centuries earlier. The idea of passports, too, is older than many realize. Medieval travelers often carried letters of passage, signed by church or secular authorities, confirming that they were not criminals or fugitives. These early documents included names, physical descriptions, and sometimes the purpose of one's journey. Borders were less formal then, but movement between territories still required proof of identity. When you present your passport at an airport today, you are acting out a medieval tradition scaled to global proportions. Another medieval rule you continue to follow involves the division of labor. Occupations were strictly regulated by guilds, associations that controlled training, prices, and standards. A blacksmith could not suddenly declare himself a baker. A carpenter could not set up a shoemaking shop. Each craft required years of apprenticeship, examinations, and approval from guild masters. This system appears rigid by modern standards, yet traces of it remain. Professional certifications, trade licensing, and formal training processes are modern permutations of guild rules. You cannot simply decide to be a doctor, electrician, or architect without passing through a regulated system of qualifications. This is a medieval structure transposed into a technological age. Even office hierarchies reflect guild traditions. Apprentices, journeymen, and masters are mirrored today in interns, employees, and managers. The slow progression of responsibility and status still echoes the medieval belief that a person should prove themselves step by step under supervision before earning independence or authority. Another rule you rarely question is the concept of property rights, particularly the idea that land ownership conveys not just possession but responsibility. In medieval Europe, owning land came with obligations, maintaining boundaries, paying dues, defending the territory, and sometimes providing military service. Land was not simply an asset, it was a duty. Today, when you pay property taxes, maintain your yard, or follow zoning laws, you are living within a system built on medieval expectations that landowners must contribute to the broader community. Consider, too, the medieval influence on privacy. Private bedrooms were rare before the late Middle Ages. Many families slept in a single room. Privacy was a luxury. Over time, as living standards rose, people began to create separate spaces for sleeping, eating, and working. By the 15th century, wealthier homes often had a solar, a private upstairs room where the family could retreat. This idea that individuals or families are entitled to personal, enclosed spaces slowly filtered into broader society. The modern obsession with privacy, door locks, and personal boundaries has medieval origins. Even the way you feel uncomfortable when someone enters your room without knocking stems from centuries of slow cultural change. You can also explore the influence of medieval religious habits on modern social behavior. Many customs related to politeness, hospitality, and moral expectations stem from church teachings. The idea that one should cover their head in certain places, remove shoes in others, speak softly in sacred spaces, or refrain from certain actions on particular days all reflect rules once enforced by local religious authorities. Over time, these rules blended with secular etiquette, and while the religious intent may have faded, the behaviors persisted. For instance, the modern idea of quiet hours in apartment buildings resembles medieval curfews enforced by town guards. Bells rang at evening to signal that fires should be covered, businesses closed, and noise reduced. These curfews were essential for safety in dense towns built of wood. Today, although fire hazards have changed, The expectation of nighttime quietness persists in many places. You might also consider your relationship with light. The medieval reluctance to waste candles created habits that still linger subtly in modern life. People rose early to maximize daylight. They avoided unnecessary lighting. They associated nighttime with rest rather than productivity. Even now, many people feel more energetic in the morning and sluggish after sunset, not because of biology alone, but because of centuries of cultural reinforcement. The rhythm of active by day, resting by night, persists in work schedules, store hours, and the general pace of society. Another subtle medieval rule influences your food habits, the idea of meals at fixed times. Medieval Europeans typically ate two main meals, a late morning dinner and an evening supper. This pattern eventually shifted to accommodate industrial work routines, but the basic concept of structured mealtimes remained. Even now, breakfast, lunch, and dinner are treated as fixed anchors in the day. The expectation that meals should be taken at consistent hours is a cultural inheritance from times when food preservation, fire management, and labor schedules demanded regularity. Your relationship with animals also carries medieval influence. Many rules governing the treatment of livestock, pets, and working animals originated in medieval law codes. For example, the idea that animals must not roam freely in towns was enforced to prevent damage to crops and property. Today, laws requiring leashes, fences, and controlled movement of pets reflect the same logic. Likewise, regulations concerning animal welfare mirror medieval concerns about maintaining reliable work animals, particularly horses and oxen, which were essential to survival. Even mundane objects around you bear medieval fingerprints. Consider shoes. Medieval shoemakers standardized left and right shapes, developed size categories, and introduced functional designs to suit different trades. These small decisions evolved into the modern system of shoe sizing and specialization. Or think about keys and locks. Medieval locks were simple mechanical devices, yet they introduced the idea of personal compartments, private storage, and secure possessions, concepts still central to modern life. One of the most surprising medieval habits still affecting you is the idea of home. The word itself comes from Old English, meaning a place of safety or rest. In medieval society, home was not merely a building but a social unit defined by obligations, hospitality expectations, and communal responsibilities. When you think of home as your safe place, your quiet refuge, or your center of belonging, you are echoing a medieval worldview deeply embedded in language and culture. And yet, perhaps the most persistent medieval rule is one you rarely consider: the belief that society must be structured. The hierarchy of medieval life, lords, vassals, guilds, clergy, peasants, created an expectation that people occupied defined roles. Modern structures are more flexible, but the mindset remains. Workplaces, governments, and social groups still rely on organized roles, ranks, and responsibilities. You navigate these systems daily, perhaps without realizing how ancient the underlying logic truly is. As you reflect on these countless lingering habits, a curious question emerges. Why do these medieval rules persist even when their original purpose has faded? Is it inertia, human reluctance to change old habits? Is it the quiet comfort of structure? Or is it simply that some ideas, once rooted deeply enough, become part of the cultural soil, feeding new generations without ever revealing their origins? You might begin to sense that the medieval world is not as distant as you once believed. It lives in your routines, your expectations, your sense of time and order. But as you prepare to continue the story, you may find yourself wondering, what deeper structures, beneath the ones you've just explored, still shape your life without your awareness? If you have followed the trail of medieval rules through your daily life so far, through your schedule, your habits, your sense of order, your understanding of privacy, and even the way you eat, you may already feel that you are standing closer to the medieval world than you expected. But in this final section of the story, you will step even further inward, into the deepest layers of quiet influence. These are the rules that shaped societies for centuries. Laws about community responsibility, silence, patience, obligations, and the rhythm of routine itself. They are the oldest and most invisible threads tying the medieval world to the one you live in now. You can begin with one of the most enduring medieval concepts, the commons. In many medieval villages, common land was shared by all. People grazed their animals there, gathered firewood, and sometimes farmed collectively. No single person owned the commons, but everyone depended on them. This created a set of unwritten rules. Take only what you need, respect your neighbor's access, and maintain the shared space. Violating these rules meant harming the entire community, not just oneself. Today, the idea of the commons survives in ways you may not notice. Public parks, sidewalks, community wells, shared digital spaces, and even certain environmental resources operate under similar principles. You know instinctively not to litter in a park, not to block a public path, and not to hog communal spaces. These behaviors feel natural, but they are the descendants of medieval expectations that community resources must be protected for the good of all. Another medieval rule that still shapes you is the concept of waiting your turn. This may seem obvious now, but in medieval Europe, crowd control was an essential skill. At markets, fairs, and during festivals, people gathered in large numbers. Without rules about taking turns, disputes broke out. Market officials enforced order by assigning stalls, controlling queues, and preventing merchants from cutting in front of one another. Over centuries, this evolved into the general social expectation that people queue, wait, and respect the sequence of arrival. You follow this rule every day when you wait in line at a store, stand in traffic, or pause behind someone at an ATM. The medieval world instilled the idea that fairness depends on order, not force. And although the medieval market inspector is long gone, the habit of queued patience remains one of the most stable rules in modern life. You may also find it interesting to explore silence as a rule, another medieval inheritance that lingers quietly in modern habits. Silence was valued in many medieval contexts. In monasteries, where quiet allowed for reflection and prayer, in courts, where silence signaled respect for legal proceedings, and in homes, where noise was controlled to avoid disturbing neighbors in densely packed wooden buildings. The idea that certain spaces demand quiet, libraries, hospitals, classrooms, sacred places, originated from medieval practices that regulated noise to maintain order and safety. Even the modern idea of speaking softly indoors, of lowering your voice in shared spaces, reflects medieval concerns about fire hazards, thin walls, and crowded living areas. Silence was not a matter of politeness alone. It was essential for survival. Today, although the wooden walls and open hearth fires of the past are gone, the sense that quiet is sometimes necessary remains embedded in your behavior. Another medieval rule that shaped daily life was the regulation of nighttime activity. After sunset, medieval towns became unsafe. Streets were dark, unlit except by the occasional lantern or torch carried by a watchman. Criminal activity increased. Fires were more likely to break out. Because of this, many towns enforced strict curfews. Bells signaled when people should return home, cover their hearth fires, or cease noisy work. These curfew bells did more than control behavior. They set the rhythm of the community's nights. Today, although curfews are rare in most places, echoes remain. Neighborhoods often become quieter at night. People naturally withdraw indoors. Cities dim their lights in residential areas. The expectation that nighttime is a time of rest rather than activity is rooted in centuries of medieval caution. You can also look at the continued influence of medieval rules on communication. In a world without instant messaging, people relied on messengers, letters, and verbal reports. These methods required patience, clarity, and trust. Important messages were repeated aloud to ensure accuracy. Letters were sealed with wax to guarantee authenticity. Instructions were organized into clear, sequential lists to prevent misinterpretation. Modern communication still reflects these habits. You follow structured email formats, sign documents, confirm identities, and speak carefully in professional settings. Even the phrase in writing carries medieval weight. Written records were the most reliable evidence a person could offer. When you feel safer having something written down, an appointment, a schedule, a promise, you are relying on a medieval rule that equated writing with truth. Another medieval influence can be found in the rule of obligations, the idea that being part of a community means participating in shared responsibilities. In medieval villages, individuals owed work to lords, service to their guilds, and aid to their neighbors. These obligations ensured communal stability. If a roof collapsed, neighbors helped repair it. If someone fell ill, others tended their animals. Today, while the nature of obligations has changed, the expectation remains. You help your community, obey local regulations, participate in civic duties, and follow social norms. These responses feel automatic because they are built on centuries of communal obligation. You might also examine the medieval relationship between work and identity, which still influences your life. In the Middle Ages, a person's occupation often defined their entire existence. John the Miller, Mary the Weaver, or Peter the Carter were not merely names but identities. Work shaped social status, relationships, and opportunities. This connection between work and self continues today. People often introduce themselves by their profession. Society values certain roles more than others. Your work helps define your routine, your sense of purpose, and your place in the community. Even the idea of a career path, a progression from beginner to expert, resembles the medieval journey from apprentice to journeyman to master. Modern promotions, job titles, and merit-based systems mirror structures created centuries ago by guilds to maintain order and ensure quality. Another medieval rule that still influences you is the connection between ritual and daily repetition. Medieval life was filled with rituals, morning prayers, midday bells, evening reflections. While many of these rituals were religious, they also provided structure and comfort. Modern life has its own secular rituals. Morning routines, coffee breaks, exercise habits, evening wind downs, all provide rhythm and predictability. These routines feel natural because humans have been shaped by centuries of structured repetition. You might also consider the medieval idea of moral conduct, which still appears in modern expectations. Rules about honesty, generosity, loyalty, modesty, and restraint were enforced by religious and secular authorities. They shaped the behavior of individuals within communities. Today, these rules persist as social expectations. You know instinctively that lying, stealing, or breaking promises damages trust. Although modern society is less rigid, the moral framework created in the Middle Ages still informs your understanding of right and wrong. The way you interpret symbols and authority also carries medieval influence. Coats of arms, banners, and seals were once used to represent families, cities, and institutions. They conveyed legitimacy and identity. Today, logos, emblems, and official stamps serve similar purposes. You recognize authority through symbols, government seals, company logos, legal insignias, just as medieval people did. Even the design of your living spaces carries medieval logic. Medieval homes were arranged around central hearths, with outer rooms used for specific tasks: storage, sleeping, cooking. Although modern homes are larger and more complex, the idea of dividing spaces according to function remains. Kitchens are separate from bedrooms. Bathrooms are private. Living areas are communal. These distinctions reflect centuries-old ideas about heat, light, safety, and cleanliness. You can also trace modern social etiquette, greetings, gestures, courtesy, to medieval customs. Bowing, removing hats, offering seats, and speaking respectfully emerged from feudal hierarchies and courtly manners. Today, although the gestures have changed, the underlying rule remains. Society values politeness and respect. Another subtle medieval rule survives in your perception of time's movement. The medieval world saw time as cyclical, following natural rhythms: seasons, harvests, daylight. This mindset persists. People still anticipate seasonal changes, mark the year with holidays, and follow weekly cycles. Even if technology has reshaped life, your internal calendar still feels rooted in ancient patterns. You may also be surprised to discover that your relationship with money is influenced by medieval banking innovations. Double-entry bookkeeping, credit systems, interest rates, and financial contracts all developed in medieval Europe. The expectation that financial transactions must be recorded, verified, and balanced originated from merchants trying to bring order to complex trade networks. Every time you check your bank balance, sign a contract, or make a purchase, you are using medieval tools adapted to a digital age. As you piece together these many threads of influence, you begin to see the medieval world not as a distant past, but as a quiet companion to your daily life. Its rules endure not because they are necessary, but because they became woven into human behavior across generations. They feel natural, automatic, unquestioned. And yet, when you pause to examine them, you find that many no longer serve their original purpose. Still, habits persist, systems endure, and people continue to follow rules created centuries ago by communities trying to make sense of their world. And perhaps that is the most curious part of all. You are still living with the choices of people who could not imagine your life, your technology, or your world. Their rules survive because humans prefer familiarity, because change is slow, and because some structures, once built, shape everything that comes after. And so you are left with a final question. If the medieval world still quietly shapes your routine today, how many other invisible histories shape the life you have not yet examined? By now, you've followed the quiet threads of medieval influence through the visible parts of your routine. Your timekeeping, your work habits, your expectations of order, your rhythms of eating and resting. But there are still deeper currents beneath these surface patterns, currents that shape the modern world in ways too subtle to notice unless you stop and observe. In this final section of Story 1, you will travel through the lingering aftershocks of medieval life that continue to shape everything from your language to your understanding of community, authority, security, and even the meaning of comfort. You can begin with language, perhaps the most persistent carrier of medieval rules. So many words you use today, words that feel entirely modern, are in fact echoes of medieval law, social structure, and daily life. Consider the word lord, which comes from the Old English hlaf word, meaning loaf guardian, the person responsible for distributing bread in a household, or the word lady, from hleftage, meaning she who kneads the bread. The origins are strikingly domestic. They remind you that power in medieval society was tied not only to land, but to the ability to provide sustenance. Other words, knight, guild, villain, steward, chamber, market, rent, tenant, harbor, court, parish, sergeant, all come loaded with medieval context. When you speak these words, even casually, you are participating in a linguistic tradition shaped by centuries of slow, deliberate evolution. Language is a silent archive of rules once enforced with great seriousness. You also carry medieval structure in your sense of community responsibility. Medieval villages operated on cooperation. Roofs were repaired collectively. Crop failures were managed with shared granaries. Water sources were protected through village councils. Your modern expectation that neighbors should respect boundaries, maintain cleanliness, and keep noise within acceptable levels has roots in these communal enforcement systems. Even homeowners associations, neighborhood watch groups, and city ordinances derive their logic from medieval forms of local governance, where cooperation was essential for survival. One of the most unchanging rules across centuries is the idea of fair exchange. Medieval markets operated under strict regulations to ensure that buyers and sellers behaved honestly. Inspectors tested weights, measured grain, and checked the purity of metals. Fraud could result in public humiliation or severe penalties. Today, although the punishments have changed, the expectation remains that what you buy should match what is promised. Consumer protection laws, warranties, receipts, return policies. All these modern safeguards are built upon medieval attempts to standardize fairness. Even modern courtesy retains medieval elements. Greetings, for example, evolved from gestures intended to show peaceful intent. A raised hand showed that no weapon was being concealed. Bowing lowered one's head, a vulnerable posture indicating trust. Removing a hat in public spaces originated as a sign of humility. Over time, these gestures softened and became polite habits rather than survival strategies. Yet you still follow them instinctively, nodding, offering a hand, speaking gently to strangers. Courtesy, like many medieval rules, shifted from necessity to tradition without ever fading away. The influence stretches into architecture and urban planning as well. Medieval towns grew organically, with winding streets shaped by property boundaries, rivers, or the whims of early settlers. As cities expanded over centuries, modern infrastructure had to adapt to these ancient layouts. In many European cities, the oldest streets dictate the flow of modern traffic. Narrow alleys, irregular intersections, and clusters of buildings all reflect medieval decisions about space. Even in newer cities, the idea of a town center, a central square, or a main marketplace is borrowed from medieval design principles that prioritized accessibility and communal gathering. Perhaps more surprising is the medieval influence on your perception of wealth and poverty. In the Middle Ages, wealth was tied almost entirely to land. Those who controlled land controlled resources. Those without land were seen as dependents, laborers, or wanderers. This idea, that economic worth is tied to property, persists today. Homeownership remains a central measure of stability. Land continues to carry both symbolic and practical power. Property taxes fund essential services. Renting versus owning still shapes social narratives. All of this reflects an enduring medieval mindset about possession and belonging. Another subtle but powerful medieval rule is the connection between order and safety. Medieval towns were highly vulnerable to fire, disease, invasion, and crime. To reduce risks, authorities enforced rules about storage, building materials, latrine placement, and even where animals could roam. The idea that rules exist primarily to prevent harm, not merely to maintain authority, originated in these long periods of trial and error. Today, when you obey traffic laws, follow safety regulations, or respect public guidelines, you are acting out a worldview formed over centuries. The belief that rules, even dull ones, are safeguards built from past mistakes. Think also about the medieval roots of information control and public announcements. Without mass media, towns relied on criers, bells, posted notices, and church sermons to circulate news. The idea that the community must be informed through centralized communication survives today in government. Announcements, public notices, digital alerts, and social media policies. The expectation that important news must be shared publicly and that people have a right to be informed comes straight from medieval traditions of communal knowledge. You can also explore the lingering medieval influence on your understanding of identity. Medieval people belonged to many overlapping groups: villages, guilds, families, parishes, and lordships. These identities determined rights, responsibilities, and social connections. Today, you still navigate multiple layers of identity: citizenship, profession, religion, family lineage, and online communities. This layered structure remains a medieval template, expanded and modernized, but still deeply recognizable. Even your relationship with authority has medieval roots. The idea that leaders owe protection and fairness to the people beneath them reflects feudal ideals of mutual obligation. While modern governments function differently, the expectation that leaders must justify their decisions, protect their communities, and maintain stability echoes long-established medieval values. Concepts like due process, fairness, appeals, and accountability evolved slowly from early legal practices designed to reduce arbitrary rule. Perhaps the most persistent medieval idea is the belief that routines create stability. Medieval life was defined by predictable cycles: dawn to dusk, seed time to harvest, feast days to fast days, prayer hours to rest periods. These routines provided comfort in an unpredictable world. Today, your routines, morning rituals, work hours, weekend habits, serve the same purpose. They anchor you, giving structure to modern complexity. Even when routines become dull, they remain reassuring, much like the bells that once marked the passing hours for medieval villagers. Another curious medieval influence is the modern obsession with comfort, a value shaped over centuries of technological and cultural change. Medieval people sought comfort in small ways: warmth near a hearth, sturdy shoes, well-fitted garments, benches instead of floors. As living standards improved, the idea of comfort grew from a privilege to an expectation. Today, comfort shapes nearly every part of life: furniture design, clothing materials, indoor temperature, bedding, food textures, even ergonomic tools. The medieval yearning for physical ease, subtle, persistent, always present, set the foundation for a world where comfort is both a pursuit and a standard. All of these influences, linguistic, social, architectural, moral, legal, and emotional, point toward a larger truth: that history does not vanish when its era ends. Instead, it lingers, shaping the lives of people who never touched the original context. Medieval rules, once essential for survival, now function as cultural habits, invisible frameworks, and quiet assumptions. And yet the most intriguing aspect may be this: many medieval rules continue simply because no one has chosen to remove them. They remain because replacing them requires effort, because old habits feel familiar, because society functions well enough without questioning every inherited structure. In this way, the medieval world survives not through monuments or stories alone, but through your daily actions, mundane, routine, unnoticed. You follow medieval rules when you stand in line, check a clock, lock your door, cook at specific times, follow a work schedule, obey local laws, expect fairness, or respect community spaces. You follow them when you speak certain words, interpret gestures, or trust written agreements. You follow them when you navigate cities, pay taxes, or rely on structured authority. These rules, the quiet architecture of your life, are the footprints of a world that seems distant but lives on through habit. As this story draws to a close, you may find yourself reflecting on how seamlessly the medieval past blends into your modern routine. You might begin to wonder how much of your daily behavior comes from conscious choice and how much flows from centuries of inherited expectations. Perhaps the most thought-provoking question of all is this: if medieval rules still guide your life in ways you've never noticed, what other forgotten eras, ancient, distant, or unexpected, continue to shape the world you move through each day?